started off. Todd's a hydrologist with DNRC's Water Sciences Bureau. He wears many hats, focusing on water measurement, water supply studies, and integrated hydrologic modeling. And he's also looking, or he's always looking for opportunities to learn what data people need to effectively manage water resources. And I know a lot of folks in the room are engaged in that sort of work. And so this should be great. Thanks again, Todd, for being here, and I'll let you take it away.
Absolutely. I'm gonna share my screen and make sure we can all see it. Does that look good? Okay.
I can see it.
Thanks, Terry, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for attending. So a little bit more, I guess, about me. I've been with DNRC for 3 years now as a hydrologist. Prior to that, I worked on river restoration projects in Idaho and was a research associate in geomorphology and earth surface processes for a little while. I got a degree in geosciences and environmental studies from the University of Montana and a master's in watershed science from Utah State. And I wanted to start a conversation today about, well, kind of about a project that we have going on over at DNRC that we work with watershed groups and committees a lot. So we know that, you know, the people component and the sharing and collaborating with ideas and data is really important to the work that we do in understanding the state's water resources. So this project kind of came about from a project that we just recently finished part of with the Lola Watershed Group on Lola Creek. And it's become more of this statewide effort. And rather than just say, here's a, you know, proposal type presentation, here's what we're doing, here's what it is, I kind of wanted to frame it around more of a narrative or a story of like why we're doing it and what the end goal, hopefully in terms of management, is going to be. So I'm just going to put the question right here at the start, since this is supposed to be a conversation. What do we actually need to manage water resources in terms of information? I want everybody to think about that through this. So I'll kick it off with something that's, you know, specific to what I do, which is work for a state agency that's been tasked with regulating and conserving a public resource, in this case, water. So, but this question might have a different answer for other people in the group, and that's really what I'm curious to hear after the presentation. So, what do you need for water resources? A good place to start is the water cycle. I know maybe it's a little elementary, but it has all of the components that you might want to know if you were tasked with managing such a large resource. And at face value, if someone were to ask me, well, what information do you need? I'd say, well, all of it, which usually isn't practical. And then how would you get it? Well, measure it. That's the most accurate, the best way, right? And fortunately, a lot of the things on here, as everybody in this group probably knows, we can measure, and we do measure. Problem solved, right? Yeah. It'd be a short presentation if that was the case, but I was leading you into the first roadblock. You soon discover that measurement is really just at a single point. It only gives us, you know, just really, it's still really invaluable, but you learn quickly that these hydrologic processes are complex, and they're complex because they vary a lot over the landscape. It could vary a lot from where you're measuring and just over the ridge or just downstream. This makes it really expensive to measure them kind of on the spatial frequency that we need the data. But luckily, a century of scientific advancement has sort of at least led in the right direction of solving that problem too. So academia and scientists gone out, they've used that point measurement to develop mathematical equations that can really just simulate what's happening in nature. And they're pretty good at it. And when you collect a whole bunch of those equations together, you ended up with these really sophisticated hydrologic models, which can give you information across the whole landscape about the hydrology. So another problem solved, right? You get a sophisticated model, you spend a lot of time building it, you calibrate it, and then you compare it to a gauge on a system you're working on, and you get this. well, that doesn't look that great. They're supposed to match up, right? So what's going on here? And the answer is really in the title of this talk. This is a product of the human component, right? These models are good at one job, but they're not very good at the human component. And to kind of highlight the complexities and challenges that come along with that, we're going to take a trip to a different place. And we'll fly about 1,600 miles to the border to the south. I'm going to talk about the Rio Grande, not just because I've worked on it, but because I think it's a really valuable place to learn lessons from. A lot of these challenges have been going on for a long time down there. And it's a place for a lot of firsts in terms of water resources. So for those of you that have never been or don't know much about it, it's one of the longest rivers in North America. It drains a very large area in the American Southwest and northern Mexico. Everybody probably knows it forms the majority of the international border with Mexico. But one thing is it's been inhabited for a really long time by multiple indigenous groups that practiced early irrigation agriculture. It was actually the site of the first European settlements north of Mexico at the time. And more relevant to our story, it was actually where water measurement in the US began. You can kind of see that little star up there, a place called Embudo, New Mexico. The birthplace of systematic stream gauging. That's where the USGS put their very first gauge in the 1880s. They used it as a training ground for the nation's first hydrographers. And it's kind of continued that it's kind of a data-rich environment. There's been people there for a long time. It has history, and therefore it has data. Great. So we have data, and we have data going back to a long time ago, right? That's what you need to overcome the human component if you're there before humans were there. Well, not exactly the case. Again, the Rio Grande was actually this nation's first battleground for water with Mexico. And by the time they started, there's a reason they started measuring water there really early. And it's because it was already a system that was strained for water supply. This created a really immediate need for management and policy decisions to be made, even though there wasn't a lot of information to make those decisions. So by that time, when measurement started full scale, and there was all these discussions about where should we build a reservoir? How big should we make it? How frequently would it fill? How much water should we give to each country? A lot of complicated questions that needed answering. And all they had was data that was already measuring a flow regime that was affected. Right? You can kind of see in the graph there that, it started in the 1850s and was pretty affected by the turn of the 19th century. Leads to this kind of management, right? I mean, it's a story probably a lot of people know, and it's not because the people at the time didn't know how to deal with these things. It's just they didn't have the information that they needed. They didn't have the tools that we have today either. So if we go back to our question, in this case, what was needed? And from my, from where I stand, in my experiences, I would say an understanding of the natural flow regime. And a lot of these water resources problems can start here. Remember, the flow regime is not just how much water flows by a point in a year. It's what is the timing of those flows, the duration of them, the magnitudes, how frequently does it happen? And it's not just for a year or a couple, it's a long span of time. And so some of the products that you can get when you have a full understanding of this is, in the bottom left there, those are natural flows reconstructed from tree rings. Gives you annual volumes for hundreds of years. You can assess drought, frequency, and severity. An important thing to know when you're going to make decisions on how a system is managed. Just a basin-wide spatial budget to see where water in the whole basin is coming from and where it's accumulating. And then daily hydrographs that you can compare those daily flows from the affected flow regime and the natural one. That's super useful product for a lot of water management practices and also ecological implications or applications. So that's an answer from my from where I stand and what I do. Today, what does it look like? There's a significant human component on the Rio Grande, right? And I think this is the story in a lot of places. And it's a lot of stuff to measure and a lot of stuff to track, but it was built in, right? It was there from the beginning, and then all of these decisions had to be made prior to those initial ones. So it's kind of like even if you get new information about the natural flow regime, which we have now, you're kind of stuck, right? It's really hard to change because you've built so much based on those past decisions. So move on from the Rio Grande example with a recap of the human component and the challenges that I wanted to highlight, which is it's driven more by human behavior, economics, all these other factors, less so than nature, which makes it really hard to predict. It's been around longer than measurement, which is a really big challenge. And in most places, it's really not well understood or measured enough to, put a number to it. People have probably seen some of these recent headlines, other river basins that kind of suffered the same fate. They were forced into making a decision early on with not enough information. It doesn't have to be water supply driven. It can be electricity driven, hydroelectric power. It can be ecosystem driven. But there are quite a few studies out there that try to put numbers on this, but it's estimated that there's only 38% of the world's major river systems that maintain a natural flow. So the human component it's a major part of the water cycle that sometimes is just kind of shoved to the side. If we come back to Montana, same thing, right? This is a map of DNRC's administrative basins. Don't worry too much about that. They're basically just Huck 8 watersheds. But this is the kind of start of the project that I was talking about, is identifying where the human component is significant enough that it's probably changed the flow regime. And so going through basin by basin, and this is our rough estimate of that. So the ones highlighted in yellow there. Now we go back to our water cycle. We've identified that these are the things included in the human component, and that we have these really awesome models that we can use, but they're really only good for those white basins in the state. Remembering our graph, So for everywhere else, we need a different approach, and that's kind of where we went with developing this project that we've been working on, which is mostly still a modeling project, but I like to think of it more as an information gathering exercise as well, because that's what we need to really feed accurate models, even if we have the software to do it. And so I just kind of summarized our thought process with this project conceptually here, where this would be the flow of information, right? So you'd have the human component there, which is always constrained by nature. And then you have the free flow of information, which has always kind of been the case between policy and management and the human component, right? Policy dictates what we can and can't do, and then the human component, abides by that. So there's this flow of information back and forth. So how it has historically worked, and when you think how it maybe should work, is you open up those two pathways. The one connecting the human component and nature is actually just understanding or measuring enough of the human component, so that would be those yellow basins in the state, so that we can understand the natural cycles more, and then that information can be passed on to management decisions or policy decisions. And in this context, one could argue, we can't go back in time, but when you look at Montana, it hasn't yet suffered from some of the things that really locked these other, like the Colorado and the Rio Grande, was this enormous growth in population. And we have affected flow in the state of Montana, but we haven't seen this massive, we don't have 40 million people depending on our water resources, but people are moving here. So if you thought maybe there's a way we could get ahead of what has already happened in other basins, that was kind of how we were approaching it. And really, you know, here's the models again. We can stand on the shoulders of a century of scientific advancement for hydrologic models, but it's really these detailed river systems models that we're building across the state that's the heart of this project. And those things are specifically designed to account for human actions, policy, agreements. When nature isn't governing the system, it accounts for the things that actually are. And we're calling it the Montana Integrated Hydrologic Modeling Framework, or MIM for short. But I didn't want to spend too much time on all the technical parts of it, but I wanted to, you know, just end with saying that we realize that to do this, we need collaborative relationships. Sharing data is a trust exercise. Not everyone wants to do it, but that data it's collected across the state that maybe no one has access to is really vital to developing this understanding of the natural cycles, which then we can propagate to our management decisions. So, and then, you know, new avenues for sharing that. We have technology now that allows for passing data back and forth in large quantities. So, and that's all I had to kind of kick the conversation off. And I didn't, like I said, go into the technical thing. If people want to hear more about the actual framework, I do have a couple other slides that we could walk through as a discussion point, but otherwise I wanted to put these up here to just kind of guide people's thoughts of what I'm interested in hearing.
Great. Thanks, Todd, for that. That's a lot of ground in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. Normally we will you know, stop screen sharing so that everybody can see one another, but maybe we can, because these questions are really helpful to see. Maybe, I don't know if people are aware, they can sort of shrink. You can go up to view in the top right and choose side-by-side gallery, and then you can kind of shrink down Todd's slide there. There's a bar in between the videos and his slide that you can kind of hover over and just move it to the left. And does that work for everybody? So we can see faces and also the questions on this slide? Great. And again, you can stay off camera if you want, but this just allows us to see one another, those of us who are able to be on camera. Yeah, we've got the questions here. What are everybody's thoughts?
Well, I think, you know, when you talk about relying on models, obviously it's one of the right approaches. You can't rely on just models, but I think they're pretty indispensable for trying to get a baseline idea. I'm curious. I personally have never done this in the Beaverhead, but I know it's getting to be more and more common. I wonder if really having a water budget and going through all the monitoring and stream flow work that it takes to get a water budget, if that's kind of baseline for being able to do this kind of work in individual watersheds, or if the modeling can replace some of that. I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, so the type of model, a river system model, some people call them a water management model. That's really what they are. That they're not like, you know, a hydrologic model is someone has gone out and done these rigorous studies in a really confined area and parameterized some process, built it into a model. Where a water management model is it's not really as much math as it is just a water budget. It's a water budget that keeps track of all the information for you, and it's, you know, where that information should go, like to this irrigation district or a reservoir. You know, it kind of just keeps track of that spatial component for you, but it has to be fed by information that you either collect on the ground or is existing already. So that's the nice thing about them is when you fall back on it, it's not so much of like, here's this black box of a model, we don't know what's going on. It's more of just a convenience factor for keeping track of boatload of information, you know. And the nice thing about it is once it's built, it can run near real time, you know, so your water budget can continue to be updated. But you're absolutely right that you still have to collect the info to do the budget. Can't get around that. That's the big point here. And that's a major component of the studies that we're doing in DNRC is we're going to be looking more to that the people component and getting to work with the right people that know what data sets exist and how we can get them and use them and things like that.
Anyone else? And I forgot to mention this, but we sort of frame all these conversations this way is I know a lot of you in the room have experience with, maybe not with modeling so much, but certainly with the human component and water management. And so, you know, feel free to ask questions of the whole group. Feel free to share your own experiences in this as well. And I know that Todd is especially wanting to hear, I guess it's question 3 and 4 here. Like I think DNRC really wants to know, like, if we lived in a fantasy world, what kind of information would you want? What information, what piece of water data would you need? So yeah, feel free to speak up and share your own experiences too.
Well, while other people are thinking, I'll go again. I think any of us that work in a reservoir controlled system, I'm sure you know the water rights get really complicated. You know, you've got the metaphor of the two different colors of water. You got contract water, and then you've got the decreed water rights. And I know that is a huge part of it is just measurement. You know, it's head gates and it's weirs and stuff like that. But as far as the fantasy world, that would be the huge thing, is really a good way to keep track of where all that water is going and which of it is contract, which is decreed. And sometimes there's multiple decrees in addition to contract water. That's where it really gets messy. And, you know, people manage it pretty well, but as water gets more scarce, that management will get harder and harder. Pretty much, you know, in the spring, everybody gets along and they just open up the head gates because there's so much water, they're really not even measuring. And so everybody gets their water. But as water gets more scarce and kind of comes in floods and droughts instead of steady, that measurement is going to be more and more important, I think. But yeah, that'd be my fantasy world, is where we can really track all of that and we know the different colors.
That's interesting. We think along the similar line. That's the fantasy world I would think of too. I often think, like, if we could measure everything coming out of a river, we wouldn't really need to gauge the river itself. You know, you could just measure at one place and then we would know everything that's leaving, coming back in, you know. But yeah, that it just, when you look at what that would take, it's a fantasy world. But those are good things to know. I mean, these are, you know, they just give us ideas as we're developing this project, which, you know, we'll finish building this framework, but I have a feeling the project will continue on in the future and iterative improvements will always be being made. So, you know, if there's things out there that people want to see, I guess it's just a matter of, when we're going out to collect data or information in a particular basin, we'll know what to focus on, you know, like things like that. Like, focus on finding as much info as we can about the two colors of water.
I'm curious how different people in the room, I know Lindsay's pretty new to Missoula stormwater, and CD work is different, but how do you all use this information? Like, what kind of hydrologic information are you using in your jobs in the day-to-day, or maybe some of our agency folks, Amy or Lisa or Josh?
This is Josh. I'm a noxious weed guy. I was just curious. This looked interesting and how it would carry over to my world. And so I just kind of listening in. Yeah.
Great, broadening our horizons.
At the stormwater division, everything that we are looking at is like how things affect the aquifer, and the Clark Fork River recharges our aquifer, so it's pretty important. The flow of the Clark Fork River is pretty important for us. I do have like more of a water quality question in pertain to the human component. The Montana State Legislature in 2021, I think, got rid of TMDL requirements or nutrient requirements. And I know folks are on the call from DEQ and NRC, the DNRC. I just wonder like how that affects your work or.
That's,
Yeah, I think I would defer to DEQ for that one.
I think that's a Lisa question.
And I would probably defer you to our AMP scientist because that's still an ongoing issue that we're discussing and trying to figure out how to solve, unfortunately. So if I can maybe get you in touch with our scientist, I could help you out with that.
Yeah, the human component of water quality is a thing too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's, you know, that's like what I said from the beginning, like that, this will be different depending on the lens you're looking at. You know, a water quality lens is going to be different than the fisheries, you know. My specific one is really just water supply. So, but yeah, it affects a lot of things across the board, and it's just interesting to see, you know, to hear what things people look at from day to day, you know, to make decisions for, you know, a lot of you work in the field professionally. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Amy, were you going to say something or were you just turning your?
I was going to mention kind of why I was interested in sitting in on this. And one of the big reasons is that with passage of the CSKT compact, we're now co-owners of the Milltown water right. And so that's going to kick in 2025 in terms of being able to make call. And so we're trying to deal with, you know, the human component of how do you deal with an entire, you know, upper Clark Fork basin that has multiple sub basins, some of which already run under, you know, water commissioners or have kind of unstated agreements on how they run the water, how to, I guess, looking for some input on how the human component has been dealt with water distribution systems as we kind of work with the tribes to get a grasp on how we're going to incorporate the Milltown right. So it's a big task and there's a huge human component to it. So that's why I was sitting in on this. And I don't know, you know, I don't know how much of this is the management is going to come down to the science of what's actually in the basins versus, you know, agreements. You know, ideally we would have kind of a Blackfoot challenge kind of set up where you've got shared water use agreements, those types of things, and all the sub basins. It's not realistic to, you know, do that by 2025, nor would all the you know, the humans that live in the sub basin want to necessarily do that. So anyways, any kind of input on how you know, additional water work or working with humans, proposing certain things. We've got, you know, we've incorporated Mike Roberts now that he's retired. We've kind of looking into some water commissioner, you know, timing to get a water commissioner on, costs, those kind of things to present to the humans as an option. But so any sort of input on those kind of things, I guess, is what I'm looking for.
I just, Blair, thanks for joining us. I don't know, but Blair, I believe you're with CSKT, so feel free to chime in or not on, on the Milltown water right. But yeah, that's certainly a huge water management issue right now.
Yeah, sure. I'm really sorry I had to come in late, just some things popped up in the office. I am with CSKT. I'm their wetlands conservation plan coordinator. Just because I missed the beginning, I think I'll sit and keep listening, but maybe if I have more question that I can answer a little bit better, I'll try it. Thank you though.
Yeah, thanks for chiming in a little out of context, and we will get I'll get the recording and Todd's slides out to everybody after the fact too, if you want to still check those out. So, but glad you could be here, at least for part of it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the Upper Clark Fork challenge is really something that we hear a lot from other basins as well, or at least like to that level of detail that you're going to need for the Milltown, right? We have a project right now that is actually the integrated modeling project is actually tied to several other projects, right? So Lolo was one of them. We have another one in Paradise Valley that's, tied to it. When I say tied to it, I mean through a grant. So we're like producing parts of this overall end product, I guess you could say, iteratively through these funded projects that we have. And one of them is in Paradise Valley, and that's one, I think, very similar to what they were after in terms of a deliverable is a system, whether it's measured or modeled, where all those things could be tracked and accounted for. Obviously, we're approaching it from a modeling standpoint because, just as we discussed earlier, measuring, once you get down to measuring a bunch of PODs and all these things, it's way too cost prohibitive and time intensive. But coming up with strategies where we can smartly measure the ones that we need to measure, and then use that to kind of estimate what's going on in the rest of the system is sort of the approach that we're taking there. But another thing that we have discussed, and I don't know that it's gaining a ton of traction, is there are a lot of basins in the state that have water commissioners. And currently the only repository for that information is county courthouses. It's submitted as a paper form, generally for billing, and it sits with a county clerk. You can go request it and get it, but it's a massive amount of work to go collect years and years worth of those records, digitize them, and then have them available to use for any sort of, decision making. But we have identified that that's something that probably needs to happen. In a place, one thing is a lot of the landowners in Paradise Valley have been really good about, meeting with us and everybody getting on the same page of being open about sharing data. And I know that's an issue in the Upper Clark Fork too. At first, when we pitched the project in Paradise Valley, people thought, you're going to collect data, you want us to share information and data with you, you're spying on us, this kind of very standoffish, you're a government agency. And what we do, our bureau's mostly disconnected from water rights, so it's easy to separate ourselves when we're out talking to landowners and say this is really just for a science project that's going to produce a usable result for you. But people eventually kind of came around, and we're actually getting a lot of info out of the valley there that I think will serve as a model for what we will need if we were to do this in somewhere like the Upper Clark Fork. But it takes that going around and selling people on the idea and getting them to commit to that. And then, like I said, avenues for what do we do with commissioner data? It's incredibly useful data, but there's no system set up to kind of streamline and database it.
That makes me think of a question of sort of who you're gathering data from versus who is using the end results, right? The data analyses and the models and all that stuff. And is there, I'm trying to think of how to formulate the question, but I mean, are you seeing these models and these, basin studies being useful even to individual landowners, to counties, municipalities, the ones who maybe have the most data to share and maybe are reluctant to share it? Or is it mostly being used by state agencies, nonprofits, other entities?
The goal is to move to where, and I think it'll be easier to make this case to a landowner or whoever once we have more examples of what it produces. But the goal is that, rancher A could benefit from it. I mean, the Paradise Valley study is going to be so granular, or I guess it's going to be fine resolution, because the goal was we would like an individual to be able to at least get information on the irrigation district that they're part of, right? Whether that's like, what are your, like, monitoring your ditch efficiencies in real time, or, looking at how much water your crops are actually using through satellite data. These are things that we're trying to incorporate into the framework where, and once we have a pathway set up to deliver that information to the public, then they could go and query the results that are relevant to what they want to see. And there'd be like a suite of tools that would go with that, depending on if you're an agency or an individual or a city. We could develop specific tools to package and deliver that information, and then it is useful for them. That is really the goal that we're shooting for. Lolo was not, it was a different kind of component of this, which had to do with updating the data sets that we use in our studies. So it's not quite at the fine resolution that Paradise Valley is going to be, but it was enough that, it could give an individual ranch like numbers, information about their ditches and fields. And it certainly gave information about the groundwater budget to the city of Lolo, who, operates 3 municipal wells in the Lolo Bitterroot aquifer kind of area there. And, they have an expansion plan for Lolo and realize that if a certain number of housing units go in on their sewer and water district, they're going to have to put another well in. And so we were actually able to make recommendations from that study on where they should look to drill a new well to not affect that interaction between Lolo and the Bitterroot. So yeah, I certainly think that's the direction we want to go. We're shooting really hard to not have these like, our administrator put it really, acutely academic models or exercises that are just like used for a one-off study. Oh, that's cool. We discovered something about, climate change over a 5-year period, and then no one ever looks at it again, except maybe researchers or an agency once in a while. We're trying to develop a process to deliver tools that the public can actually use. And us, I mean.
Yeah, no, that seems like a bit of the holy grail. If an irrigation district or a ditch rider or individual irrigators are like, hey, this is useful. I mean, then, more people are perhaps willing to participate and be on board with these academic studies, less than academic studies.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, it sounds very like, it almost sounds like a fantasy world, but the difference is it's being done in other places. It's being done in other places in the West. Like these tools are being used, and they are delivering those products that are, being used outside of like that government sphere. So we know that there's a model for success out there, and that's kind of why we keep it in the back of our minds as being realistic to achieve.
Anyone else want to chime in with their actual experiences using any of this kind of data, or data they still feel they need?
Well, I definitely think that it sounds like you already figured out how to get past some of the resistance to sharing data in some areas. And I think that's going to be at least one of the really critical things in this is, I guess, building that trust with people. And that's where the local conservation districts and watershed groups and those come in, is hopefully they've got those relationships developed. I know on our system, we've got Lima Reservoir that then runs down the Red Rock, which fills up Clark Canyon Reservoir, which then a whole bunch of people irrigate out of. And I've brought up ideas like seeing if people that irrigate out of Clark Canyon Reservoir would actually even pay some small amount of money to Red Rock irrigators to keep doing things like flood irrigating and have that slow, rather than being so efficient that they end up drying the river up with sprinklers, that they're actually inefficient and get a bunch of return flow. Because it has, they have, whether or not any actual investigation has proven it, everyone knows that what happens on the Red Rock directly affects whether or not Clark Canyon Reservoir fills up. And the irrigators on the Red Rock wanted nothing to do with that idea, because they didn't want to set up a situation where people irrigating out of Clark Canyon Reservoir now feel like they can demand changes on how people on the Red Rock irrigate. So there's just a lot, and I've run into trouble with them even accepting grant funds through DNRC to upgrade their irrigation infrastructure, because they think that, I think there's some sense that all of a sudden there's going to be a bunch of DNRC hydrologists crawling all over the Red Rock, watching what everybody does and monitoring their water use. And they're starting to loosen up on that as they realize that's not the case, but that will be a big thing. I think just kind of sharing, hopefully not war stories, but success stories on how people have built that trust to get people to start sharing data.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it definitely was not an instantaneous process in Paradise Valley, and there's a lot of other basins we work in too, where it's, I work a lot on the Teton River on the front, and I think it's taken over a decade for people to finally realize that measurement is really beneficial to them. And that we're not, going out and taking a measurement and running back and reporting it to some authority that's gonna, use it to take their water right away or something like that. We're just going back and putting it on a website where they can go look at it, and then their water commissioner can go look at it, and they can know how they need to turn water out to this reservoir or that reservoir based on priority dates, which everybody's beholden to anyway. But yeah, I think, and some of the most useful things that come out of, these studies that we go do is just that. One of the things we try to be as accurate as we can in the modeling framework is return flows. How much is going back to an individual source from a field, from a ditch. And so we'll go do a bunch of seepage analyses on lots of ditches, select ditches, some of the biggest ones, maybe. It just depends on, well, as well as I, the factors soil type and where the ditch goes. You can kind of lump and group some of them together, and that information they're super interested in, because we can come back and say, look, the guy across the valley over there, the reservoir, the stream really benefits from their flood irrigation, but where you're at, we don't see it benefiting them at all. You could actually probably benefit more from putting your stuff in a pipe or being more efficient. and looking at those kind of fine scale differences has been some of the things that irrigation districts are really, really interested in. Rather than the blanket, like, you know, people will they'll either go really far one direction and want to be really, really efficient with their irrigation, or they go completely the opposite way. It's like you were talking about, and say, no, everything should leak because it helps us later. And it's like, well, I mean, evidence might show it's not the case for everybody, even in one valley, you know, it can differ so much.
And so is that part of the, like, that you're striving to have, like, all the soil types? Is that part of the goal too?
Yeah, I mean, we have that represented now. It's just, we're not going out and doing anything that USDA hasn't already done. You know, we just we kind of fall back on their huge soil database for things like that.
Great. Well, we have probably time for one more question before we start wrapping it up. Question or observation, experience? Yeah, okay, well, we don't need to keep people on here any longer. Give you a few minutes of your day back, but I will just mention that MWCC does host these conversations on various topics about once a month, always on Wednesdays at noon. The next one coming up, actually, I'm going to be leading. It's February 22nd. I'm going to be diving into all the resources that MWCC has on our website, which I think get buried sometimes and people aren't always aware of. So just going through some of those resources, and maybe similar to Todd's presentation, also asking, like, is this what you need? What else do you need? But kind of doing a walkthrough of all those resources. So that might appeal to some of you. And I'll put the link to the Conservation Conversations page here. If I can find the chat. Great. And thank you everybody for being here. Thanks, Todd, so much for all the work, all the work you're doing, period, as well as the work that you put into this presentation and answering everybody's questions. And as mentioned, I think I was just noting this to Blair, but for everybody, I will be posting the recording to YouTube and sharing Todd's slides as well. It sometimes takes me a week or two to get that out to everybody, but I will email everybody on this. And before I forget, actually, I thought I put this question in the registration, but it seems I may have forgotten. I'd like to ask people if it's okay to share your email address. And all that means is that I would CC you instead of BCCing you, just in case, you know, Lindsay wants to talk to Lisa about water quality things. Or so if you're not okay with me CCing you on the email to everybody, then just put that in the chat. Please don't share my email and I'll just BCC you. But CCing everybody just kind of allows everybody to continue the conversation or reach out to people maybe you hadn't met before in the future if you need things. Todd, did you have any closing thoughts for us?
No, I just, want to say thanks to everybody for attending and for the discussion. It was great.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.